Nature means variety, and it's based on evolution. Now, can evolution overfit? Is the way that nature creates and trains species in any way similar to how we humans create and train machine learning algorithms and models? Is it worth our while to breach the gap between biological learning systems and machine learning, which is artificial? What is anomaly detection, aka one-class classification? Where can we use it? Why do we need it? Today at ML Done with my dear guest, Professor Thomas Dietterich, a world-renowned expert in machine learning. All of these questions and much more will be beautifully dissected. So, stick around. Hello everyone and welcome to ML Done. Professor Dietterich has kindly agreed to give his time to us today, and so that we could have a nice discussion over some exciting topics. And let me just say hi to Professor Dietterich. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, my pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Perfect. So let's just start off with an introduction. Could you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, so I started in, I graduated from my undergraduate degree in 1977. So, and I joined the University of Illinois in Urbana, working with a professor, Ryszard Michalski, who was one of the three people, along with Tom Mitchell and Jaime Carbonell, who organized the first machine learning workshop, which was held in 1980 at Carnegie Mellon University, and it had a vast crowd of about 30 people. The highlight of that meeting was that Herbert Simon, who is still living and was a professor at Carnegie Mellon and a Nobel laureate in economics, gave the keynote talk with a talk with the title "Why Should Machines Learn?", in which he did a very interesting job of trying to define what it meant for machines to learn. And you can still read that essay in there. So Michalski and Mitchell and Carbonell edited a book called Machine Learning and Artificial Intelligence Approach, which came out a few years later. And actually there were 3 volumes in that series, because basically the first 3 machine learning workshops, it wasn't a conference, just workshops, were produced as collections as edited collections. So then in 1979, I moved to Stanford University. My advisor was Bruce Buchanan. That was a time when the focus was on expert systems, rule-based expert systems technology. And the sense was that the hard problem was transferring knowledge from the heads of experts into the computer. And we would have a person called a knowledge engineer, whose job was to do sort of a structured knowledge elicitation from the experts, and then author rules in a rule-based system. Interestingly, a big issue in those days was getting explanations out of such systems. And a lot of good work was done in those days, realizing that the first thing people produced were basically like stacked back traces. I'd say, well, I believe this because I believe this, you could go backwards through the rule firings. But that was usually at too low a level. It was good for debugging, and those explanation facilities mostly were debuggers for the engineers, not useful to the end users. And I think we're seeing a similar phenomenon with explainable AI these days. In any case, I was, not very much in sync with the times, because I was interested in statistical learning even in those days. So I finished my degree and then came to Oregon State University. And in the early part of my career, I worked on things like the error correcting output coding idea. So if you have a problem with a large number of classes, we usually encode that as a one-hot output in our networks. But why should we do that? Why not use something like an error correcting code, where you can have, if you have 32 classes, you only need 5 bits to encode the classes. But because each bit is not going to be learned very accurately, we should add redundant bits. And so you might have, say, 8 redundant bits, or even you could have, or let's see, with 32, 5, yeah, you might have a total of 10 bits, or maybe 15 bits. And so then the idea is that the the neural network makes its predictions, and now you're getting out a string of zeros and ones, or of numbers between 0 and 1, and then you map it to the nearest code word to figure out which class is the right class. And if the network is making its mistakes independently, then you get a big improvement in accuracy as a result. It's basically turns into a different kind of ensemble method. And back in the 80s and 90s, there was a lot of experimentation with different ways of encoding outputs. Some of those we don't see very much today. Things like thermometer representations for real values, where you have a series of discrete kind of mileposts, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then if you want to encode a 5, you turn on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and turn off 6, 7, 8, whatever. I'm not sure these are good ideas, but I just wanted to. There was a lot of experimentation in those days. And then I moved into reinforcement learning toward the end of the 90s. I got very interested in hierarchies and hierarchical RL. And so I developed this thing called the MaxQ framework for encoding hierarchical reinforcement learning, that sort of showed how you could have value functions for subroutines and compose them to get value functions for the calling routine. So imagine a sort of a program structure, a hierarchy of value functions or Q functions. And you could compute the overall Q function by decomposing it into the Q functions of the subroutines. And then I got very interested in ecological problems, and so I started applying primarily reinforcement learning to problems in ecosystem management of wildfire, management of invasive species. A lot of these, we can think of them as you have to make a series of decisions over time, and you can often observe most of the state, so it fits the Markov decision process model well. I guess my current focus is, I mean, I continue with all of those interests, but my current focus is on sort of safe and robust AI. So I've been looking at the literature on how human organizations create a good culture of safety, and what are the functions that they need to have on a high reliability team. And then to try to use that to get a list of sort of the requirements for an AI system to achieve similar levels of safety. And so some of the things are situational awareness, looking for anomalies and near misses, then being able to come up with a hypotheses for what's causing those anomalies, and then updating our models or changing our approach to deal with the underlying problems. So I work a lot on anomaly detection and novelty detection, out of distribution detection, open category detection. They're all basically the same challenging problem. So.
Okay, that was perfect. You mentioned wildfire as one of the applications of reinforcement learning. I suppose it's about predicting the direction of the spread of the fire in jungles and in forests. Am I right?
Well, I mean, that is one thing people have looked at. There are reasonably good physical models of that. And in fact, the supercomputing folks are now doing highly detailed computational fluid dynamics modeling of the landscape, the fire, the smoke, the whole atmospheric behavior, the ability of the fire to pull in oxygen from the surrounding, and so they give very high resolution modeling at great expense. So of course, one of the roles for machine learning is to provide a surrogate model that is much more efficient to efficiently able to make the same predictions, particularly because we need them in much faster than real time in order to do the sort of tactical firefighting decision making. We were much more interested in long-term issues. So if one of the big problems we have with wildfire in the Western US is that from about 1915 until about 1985, all wildfires were suppressed in the Western US. And the result was that fuels, dead trees and small trees, fuels accumulated. So the structure of our forests, right, is that we have these very large trees that are very fire resistant. And it's believed that prior to European colonization, the Native Americans frequently had fires that would be low intensity ground fires that would burn out the grasses and the short young trees and preserve these very tall trees. Also encourage fresh growth, which was very useful for deer and elk, which were, their livestock in some sense. So, but when we started suppressing fires, we allowed these understory trees to become bigger, more bushes and shrubs. And so now when we have a fire, there's a huge amount of fuel available. It burns very hot and it can kill all the trees. So one of the goals is to try to transform the landscape back to one that can have frequent low intensity fires instead of these big high intensity fires. And one way to do that would be to hire people to come and remove the fuels. That's very expensive. Another thing would be to do controlled burns where under good conditions, which we haven't had this year, you could actually ignite a low intensity fire and have it burn. Of course, that's a very high risk thing, because if the fire gets out of control, whoever had that idea loses his job pretty much. So fire managers are very risk averse. And then but the third thing you could do is, if there was a fire that was ignited by lightning, you could just allow it to burn. And this is called the let burn action. It doesn't cost anything in terms of taxpayer money. It has some of the dangers, obviously, of a controlled burn. It was just started by nature instead of by the land manager. So we just looked at that binary decision: given an ignition, should you let this fire burn or not? And a lot of that comes down to, well, where is the ignition? Is it in a place where we need fuel treatment? Does it risk damaging houses and buildings and so on? So physical location. And then the other thing is the weather conditions. If it's mid-September and we think rain is coming soon, then we can let it burn. If it's mid-July and we think there's no rain for a couple of months, then we better put it out, because it will grow to be a huge fire. So our decision cycle was 1 year at a time, thinking about 100 to 150 years out. So very different kind of time scale than the tactical firefighting question.
So am I right in saying that in that scenario, if you were to apply reinforcement learning to this problem, all of these characteristics of the environment, like which month are we, how likely is it to rain, the wind direction, also like whatever it is, these are basically defining the environment of the agent, and the fire itself is the agent?
Yes, the decision maker is the land manager, or ecosystem manager, which usually would be the United States Forest Service, or if it's private land, it might be a timber company or a coalition of landowners or something.
I see. Okay, that's very interesting. Actually, I had a chat with I think one of your colleagues, Professor Mark Crowley, I think.
Okay.
Or Crowley or Crowley.
Crowley, yes, yes.
Yeah.
It's a former postdoc of mine, yeah.
Yes. All right, yeah.
Now at Waterloo, right?
Exactly. So as far as I remember, at the time, which was a few months ago, he was working on this whole idea of, but I think it was some instantaneous type of application of machine learning in terms of, okay, how is the fire going to spread now? Which direction? It just reminded me of that talk. So let's just move on. I was listening to one of your talks, and you said something that had never, ever occurred to me. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm quoting you right. So I think you mentioned that evolution is not optimization. Thus, it cannot overfit. So the generation that survives is the robust one, and not necessarily the optimal one. So could you just explain what it means? So there is no objective function in nature, as in, like, I'm going to optimize this to death?
Well, I guess the key thing is that nothing succeeds like success is kind of the rule of evolution, right? That the evolution doesn't have a goal in the sense of it's not trying to create more intelligent life forms or bigger or whatever. It's just that whatever organisms were able to survive when they were alive are the ones that survive and reproduce. And so they are searching a space, obviously. And there is, Darwin described competition among the species. And so there's definitely a sense of optimization there. But it's very different from the way we usually do genetic search, right? When we use evolutionary methods in computer science, we have an objective function. It is not changing, and we just have the organisms are just optimizing against it. So it basically just becomes another optimization procedure. But in nature, the objective in some sense is defined by all the other species. For one species, it's all the other species around it, and the the geology and the weather and so on, and the only goal is to reproduce, because the phenomenon will continue. The phenomenon of life will continue if it can reproduce. So now the question is, can it overfit? Well, in some sense, yes. I probably didn't state that quite right, in the sense that suppose we imagine a location on Earth that has been very stable for a long time. Then we might, a species might lose diversity under those conditions, right? Because if there are, let's just think within a single species, the individual animals or organisms are competing with each other, and the ones that are able to make more seeds or have more offspring or whatever, their traits will be propagated forward. And so we would have, and because the environment isn't changing, the selection is pointing in just one direction, basically. And so you will tend to lose diversity there. I mean, fortunately, our genetic structure, because we have recessive genes, they can exist in the population for a while, but unless they confer some advantages under some conditions, we think about things like sickle cell disease conferring some benefit against malaria, which prevents those alleles, which are otherwise quite damaging, from being extinguished from the population. So, if there is no malaria, then those will be selected against, and you will tend to overfit. And then what happens is, if the environment then changed, the species might go extinct more quickly because it has lost the diversity that would have allowed it to adapt, right? Because what allows a population to adapt, at least at the genetic level, is by having a diverse gene pool, right? So that there's a lot of diversity among the organisms.
Am I right in saying that then, so after natural selection and the crossovers and mutations and all of that, I suppose the nature would sort of favor the stronger species or the stronger level in the hierarchy, like the stronger type, whatever it is, and then this particular category, this particular subcategory, will survive eventually in the long run. But if the environment changes, then the error, basically in machine learning terms, increases. Like we fail to generalize to other environments. So that is sort of overfitting.
Yeah, I guess you could think of that as overfitting in this case, right? Yeah.
I see. All right.
But of course, it's very complicated because because there are other species, and a species that's being successful in one environment tends to disperse and come into contact with other species and compete with them. And so, that creates a disturbance this is one thing that we don't see in AI very much, is this notion of space, right? And that I'm geographically isolated, and so I can develop just by myself. But then if now some other species is able to fly in or is brought in on a ship or something, then suddenly I have competition, And so the experience in ecology, right? If the world were static and there was no dispersal, then evolution would kind of converge, right? And many species would go extinct. But we don't see that. We see, in fact, one of the sort of puzzling things is, why do we have so many species, given how long life has been? Why do we see this ramification? And of course, Darwin, that was his central question: is why are there so many species of things? And part of the argument was, well, because there's so many different niches out there, both because of geography, geographic variability, climate. But then also the different interaction of the different species. So and so one sense in ecology is that there are many sources of disturbance, and ecosystems are never in equilibrium. They're constantly being disturbed by natural disturbances like fires and earthquakes or tsunamis or whatever, but also by the constant dispersal and interaction among multiple species. And those stir things up and prevent things from settling into an equilibrium.
Right. It sort of reminds me of this whole idea of, exploration versus exploitation and reinforcement learning. It's like, I'm not going to let you exploit this.
Right. And so, yes, the disturbances in some sense are like a persistent excitation of the system that prevent it from settling into a single minimum. And that's, in some sense, what gives life its resilience, is that we have all of these different species, and they are not all living in identical circumstances. They're dispersed geographically and climatologically and elevation-wise and so on. And if the climate became uniform everywhere, then things, if we got rid of all those disturbances and heterogeneity of the environment, then things would start to converge and we might become much less resilient. So I suppose when we think about, when we envision life spreading to other stars and so on, we should do it in a highly diverse way. We need to send lots of different organisms out if we expect them to succeed at all.
I see. Very interesting. That was very interesting. So it sort of makes you feel that like all of these disturbances in nature, it sort of feels like the way we disturb our say neural networks, that we just add dropout, like just randomly kill off some nodes, and so it sort of feels like we're sort of trying to avoid getting to the global minimum, but reaching a good local minimum. Sort of
right,
like
and
that.
Also adversarial training would be another example of this, right? Yes, yeah.
Yeah, there's a sense of collectiveness in nature, apparently, that we don't have in our maybe sort of in the bubble of our servers, maybe like the machines that we're learning, we're training.
And this is why ensemble methods in general are powerful, and heterogeneous ensembles made up of substantially different architectures, approaches, and so on, optimizing different loss functions, give you added resilience. But I think we, in machine learning, I think we've barely touched the surface of this. I think people in population biology and ecology have looked a lot more at these phenomena, and probably we have a lot to learn from them, I would say.
Yeah, hopefully with this sort of not emergence, but the whole idea of multidisciplinary research is getting really stronger, and hopefully under this sort of regime, things will get much better, that people understand from other disciplines and they can collaborate so that we can understand these disciplines better. Now, so talking about nature and machine learning sort of connects me to my next question. So do you think that it's worth working on breaching the gap between biological systems and machine learning? In particular, so what we have biological neural nets, and also we have artificial neural nets. Now, if we ever try to really focus on breaching this gap, could this not be really the path to having more robust models, robust in terms of what we're talking about, so trying to really mimic nature? Now, the reason I'm asking this is because I was reading this paper about attention-based models, and they were saying that, okay, LSTMs or RNNs, there was a problem with them, and we sort of introduced the idea of attention-based models so that we could be selective as to which part of a sequence we look at. So we don't have to actually look at the entire thing. And so this is exactly how a human being reads a sentence and understands it. So it's like we are actually mimicking the nature of like how human understands a text or a sequence. That made me think, wouldn't it be really worthwhile to focus on this, to bridging the gap?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm willing to call it a gap, but let's just say, I mean, we're interested in what are the principles underlying intelligent systems, right? And so we can learn a lot from studying biological systems, but we're looking for the shared mathematical abstraction. I think it wouldn't necessarily be fruitful to do mimicry at a low level, right? I mean, if, for instance, people are mapping the brains, right, or parts of the brains of various organisms, and we could try building, the digital analog of that and wire it up the same way. And but I think that would be sort of cargo cult science. We'd be making things that look like airplanes, but they don't fly. So unless we really understand what's the computation that's happening, and it's clear that an individual neuron is a very complicated system that is doing all kinds of things inside it, and it is not a ReLU or a linear threshold unit or anything. So so I think we have to be very careful about what's the level of abstraction at which we're trying to mimic nature. But clearly, studies of the visual cortex inspired what we now have with convolutional neural networks. So we have learned a lot of things, and we've learned a lot of things from studying, how the eye works and how the ears work and so on. So, and to the extent that we can, that neuroscience can advance and help us understand more how function is achieved. I feel like right now we're studying a lot of neuroanatomy, but it's just not at all clear whether that is, if you studied CPU anatomy, it wouldn't tell you very much about how neural networks work, right? So we also have lessons to learn from ecology or from statistical physics, and obviously we've drawn on those in the past in AI, and will continue, and obviously cognitive psychology and cognitive science has been a huge inspiration. So and now we're seeing the importance of social intelligence, and particularly in a lot of these issues of communication, how can an AI system communicate with the human user, how can it avoid interrupting them, and so on. I mean, there are all kinds of and what kinds of behavior, social behavior, are our AI systems facilitating in social media, in newspapers, and so on. All of these things, as you say, it's radically interdisciplinary, and we need to draw on all of these different disciplines in psychology and sociology and anthropology and so on. So so if you say biology sort of writ large, studying human and other organisms and understanding the dynamics of their interactions with the world, then I agree with you. My colleague Jonathan Hurst here at Oregon State has this Cassie robot that is a walking robot, right? That is very much designed from looking at how, say, birds walk, ostriches, and so on. So, and it looks like a bird when it moves too. It's so, there are all kinds of important physical and mechanical findings about how those legs store energy and transmit it, that are built into the hardware, and so that the software doesn't have to be doing that and can be operating at a higher level. So it results in an extremely efficient mechanical system, much more than older generations of robots that were over actuated with lots of motors and so on, and consumed a lot of power. So
yeah, I see. But very interesting. Sort of, you mentioned the idea of like what level of abstraction are we going to start this sort of making these ML systems similar to a biological system. It makes me feel like if, for example, if we started this level of abstraction sort of from a reasonably granular level, maybe even go mad, like go all the way to a neurons level. Maybe those little changes that we could make into our artificial neural nets, for example, the fact that a neuron generates a time series rather than just a simple scalar that we do in our neural nets. Maybe this level of abstraction could result in a major change, in a higher level in terms of how that network is going to train. Maybe it's going to generalize better. Maybe it's going to find better solutions.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there of course is this whole line of research on spiking neural networks. And the main advantage seems to be in terms of power consumption, that they can be much more efficient. And so now we have these extremely low power chips that use spiking neural networks to do computer vision tasks, for example. So, yes, there's all kinds of things there. But I think you're thinking about, if we think about each neuron as a dynamical system and think about how those systems are interacting, that seems like a potentially fruitful view. And looking at the as our ability to record simultaneously from larger and larger ensembles of neurons is growing, we can learn much more about the dynamics of those systems, and I think that might help us in some ways more than the anatomy is helping us to sort of understand, to improve our mathematical models of what we're trying to build.
I see.
I think these neuro ODE ideas of thinking of it started with realizing that the ResNet could be viewed as sort of unrolled solution of a differential equation, and therefore saying, well, okay, let's think about it in continuous time and sort of infinite depth. Then you get these neuro ODEs, and those also are giving us, a new way of thinking about neural networks. And then that in turn has led to all kinds of interesting crossover research between physics and machine learning. So yeah, I mean, well, as you know, it's a crazy time right now. There's so many interesting ideas.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. I'd love to keep talking about this bit, but I'm also conscious of the time. So I've got still a few more questions to go. So next question is about one of the fundamental theorems of machine learning, where it mentions that the error of our model, which I suppose is the generalizability of our model, is directly proportionate to the model capacity, but inversely proportionate to the sample size. So I wonder if this is always the case, and the reason I'm asking this is because recently I came across this paper by Professor Mikhail Belkin, with whom I also have done an interview, which is all about this idea of double descent. And then he and his colleagues, they have mentioned that they've sort of explained that if you increase the model's capacity after a certain threshold, even though up until that threshold, the generalizability will go low, meaning that the error keeps increasing. So you're really hitting the overfitting point all the way, sort of overfitting to death. But after a certain sweet spot, the error again keeps going down. In some cases, it might actually go even below the first minimum that you had hit in the traditional U-shaped model. So if I sort of put that up against this fundamental theorem of machine learning for a fixed sample size, this says that if you increase the model capacity, the error will go up. But how could you how can we explain this with this double descent idea?
Right. So yeah, so double descent is fascinating, and I really like that paper. And basically, what they say there is right is that we in some sense the existing theory is correct, and in some sense it's broken. The sense in which it's correct is that past during the second descent phase, we're getting smoother and smoother functions, and particularly in the example they work out with these random Fourier features. The longer you train, the smoother the function space is getting. And so, from a kind of Occam's razor, point of view, we are getting functions that, because they're smoother, they are not overfitting the data, right? Mm-hmm. So if we and you can parameterize the space, and they point out with support vector machines, at least in their experiments, are not exhibiting this double descent phenomenon, because they're working in this space of smoother functions from the start. So I would say, we don't fully understand the phenomenon. The expressive power arguments basically come from they mostly come out of VC theory, right? Which thinks about the space of Boolean functions or threshold functions, and it doesn't really think about the smoothness issue, right? Mm-hmm. So the concern there was just that it essentially treats all functions in the space as kind of equally expressive, and just needs to limit the number of them, because to avoid the choosing ones that to reduce your overfitting risk, right? And so I don't think I understand the full consequences of the double descent phenomenon. But the way it feels to me, I have two conflicting intuitions. One is that when we're measuring in terms of sort of model complexity, and we're kind of counting functions that are we define some measure of how different two functions need to be considered different, right? And so we define some distance, and then we count how many functions we have. That function count is going up, and during the first phase, we're under expressive, then we're right, and then we're over expressive, and we go to this strong peak, which feels a lot like some sort of phase transition, right? Because then at some point we've got enough functions that we can represent anything, and so clearly relying on, in some sense, I guess, the sort of concept in VC theory is that we've kind of relied on just controlling the number of functions, right? And saying, well, what's the probability that one of these functions in our set would, at random, would have fit the data, right? And we've got to keep that. We've got to minimize that, because random fitting of the data is overfitting, and we're hoping that we're fitting the data because we've got the right function, right? One that's got generalization power. But the smoothness argument says, no, the way we're going to prevent overfitting isn't because we're going to restrict the number of functions, but we're going to restrict their jaggedness, and by making them smoother and smoother. I think we're simultaneously fortunate that stochastic gradient descent has a very strong desire to find smooth functions, right? Once it gets in a large flat space, it can't escape very easily. Whereas if it's in a narrow little canyon and the learning rate is big enough, then it will pop right out of it. So it has a lot of trouble finding narrow local minima, and it's much easier for it to find big flat local minima. And so the two kind of work together to make sure that we're in this much larger space of functions, we're finding the smooth ones.
but I think they also described this, I mean, showed that that phenomenon happens, I think, in decision trees as well.
Yes,
I mean,
but there they had to
non.
do a kind of a little trick, right? So, and I think it's kind of informative, right? Because up until the n equals p case, where the number of data points equals the number of parameters, you're just building, say, a complete binary tree, right? Decision tree. You can, it's just a table. You're memorizing the data. But then to get smoothness, they switched to using basically random forests, to using an ensemble. And then the smoothness happens. Now, what I think that you know, this may provide an important insight into why ensemble methods work that I didn't understand previously, and I think the field as a whole didn't understand, right? Because we've argued in the past that well, I mean, we kind of understood it, but maybe but I think we're getting a deeper understanding. We argued in the past that each member of the ensemble, we have to restrict its expressive power because of the single descent thing, and so because if it's too expressive, we get high variance. But then by averaging a bunch of things, we can reduce the variance, and we find this sort of optimal bias variance trade-off. But what the Belkin et al. Are saying is that's the wrong view. It's not totally wrong, but they're calling out the smoothness of the resulting function class, and saying, well, when you average a bunch of things, you're also now increasing the smoothness of the function, and so you can use these smoothness arguments instead to argue why you're not overfitting. Because now, you know, smooth surfaces is not one you can bend to curl around each data point. It's stiffer, but it's interesting that they have to get the result in decision trees. They have to go from sort of a single tree in the first phase to multiple trees. I suspect that they could still get the result if they restricted the depth of the trees in the pre-peak point, but it's really interesting because, you know, Ross Quinlan, who is invented the ID3 C4.5 C5 line of things, sort of, you know, simultaneously with Bryman et al. And Cart. He had a paper one year when the ensemble methods were first coming out. He had a paper in which he was basically saying these things can't possibly work right because we're making predictions in leaves of our trees where we have no data. Because and because he would say, you grow, say, an ensemble. I think he had ensembles of only maybe 10 trees, and he would show that we were getting a query that was going to an empty leaf in each of those trees, and yet somehow in the ensemble we were getting the right answer there. And he just said it just defied his logic. We don't have any evidence for that region. But what we do have is smoothness going for us. And so maybe I'm intrigued with the idea that maybe the smoothness analysis is going to give us more insight than the sort of VC combinatorial analysis, which is what we've done in the past.
I see. Perfect. Very interesting. So you see, at each one of these questions, I mean, you can discuss them for hours. Unfortunately, we have to move on. Very, very interesting. Now, this particular next question is about anomaly detection, right? Or also known as, I suppose, one-class classification, which was my own area of research during my PhD. So as you mentioned, you've worked on anomaly detection, one-class classification. So first, could you just tell us what they are and why we need them? Because sometimes when I talk to people for the first time, when I mention one-class classification, they're surprised. And what are you talking about? What is that? As opposed to multi-class classification. So, yeah.
Well, so I guess the cases I'm most concerned about have to do with sort of the safety situations. So I train up a machine learning system of some kind, and maybe it's a multi-class classifier, like an object detector, The example I used to use was, well, suppose I'm building a self-driving car computer vision system, and I want to recognize the different kinds of obstacles I might encounter on the road. Okay, and so, but maybe I train it in Sweden, for example. So I have deer, and I have children, tricycles and bicycles and pedestrians and other cars. But when I deploy it in Australia, what does it do the first time it sees a kangaroo? And does it think that maybe it's like a newspaper blowing in the wind and it can just drive through it, or does it think it's like a deer and it should stop? So this is more the open category version of the problem, right? That we encounter a new class at test time or deployment time that was not in our training data. So one idea, right, is to say, take all of our training data and now train a one-class classifier that tries to draw a boundary around our training data and says, here's where my training data lived. Okay, and now the kangaroo is going to be outside that space, we hope, in an appropriate representation. And so we can raise an alarm and say, oh, it's something weird, we better take the safe action. And so, but of course, this kind of anomaly detection is used all the time in industry, for instance, to detect manufacturing defects, or in hospitals to see this patient, something weird is happening with this patient, and we want to raise an alarm and say they need attention. Or cybersecurity, this process is behaving weirdly. Normally Microsoft Word does not access the system log or whatever it is, right? And so fraud detection in finance, or even finding the interesting samples on the Mars Science Observatory, right? My colleague Kiri Wagstaff has worked at JPL for many years, and they have deployed anomaly detectors on the Mars rovers because they take spectra with, they shoot lasers at stuff on Mars. Hopefully the Martians don't get in the way, and then measure the spectra, and then they can see that's an unusual spectrum, and so prioritize that one for being sent back to Earth. So again, you want to sort of find out what's unusual, what's novel, what's potentially risky, what's potentially a fraud. So that's why we need it. Okay.
I suppose, I mean, as opposed to multi-class classification, I suppose, so a multi-class classifier will definitely, whatever the input is, will classify it into one of the predefined classes. Right. It will never say
it is a partition of the image space or whatever, the input space,
Yeah. So now this connects to the next question. To this day, I'm not sure how we should solve this problem. So when you're dealing with multi-class classification, right? So you assume that during training you've got sort of a fair representation of all the classes that you'll be dealing with during testing, during your evaluation. Right. Now, in one class classification, if the assumption is that we don't have any anomalies or very limited amount of anomalies during training, then how can we do hyperparameter tuning without using the actual anomalies?
Right.
What's the general way of doing that?
Well, actually, I think hyperparameter tuning is not the fundamental problem, although it is a difficult one. But I've really been struck between, because I've done a fair amount of work in anomaly detection with engineered features. And in engineered features, the key thing is that we have a distance that we can use typically, right? The distance between feature vectors is semantically meaningful, unlike, say, pixel distance in images, and the anomalies will be outliers. We can measure their distance to the training data and get a sensible thing. But when we're doing anomaly detection with deep learning, where we're learning the representation, unfortunately, we only learn to represent the things that were in the training sets, and things that are outside of the training set are often not outliers when we look at them in the latent representation. So, right, if we think of the standard deep network as an encoder followed by logit, linear logit multinomial logistic regression classifier, also known as a softmax. So if we think about that last layer before the logits, and we try to use distances there, we find that they work kind of okay, but not great. They don't give us the levels of performance we need, and I think it's because I mean, my current mental model, which may be misleading, is that that when we initialize the network, our data points are kind of all mapped to sort of random points in the space that are kind of concentrated. Because there's basically a central limit theorem operating, and so they're going to kind of all be in the middle. And then as we train, the data points from different classes need to be pulled apart from each other so that we can get linear decision boundaries in there to separate them. But there's nothing that pulls apart the images that we don't have in our training data. There's nothing, and there's nothing to require or sort of impose overall smoothness or notions of distance that would apply to all images. And so, but some, I mean, obviously, novel images that are similar to known classes, they will have a representation that has been that's distinct. But I guess but this is, I think this is the fundamental challenge we face right now, is that we need some way of imposing additional constraints on our learned representations, so that they can have representations outside of the data points that they've been trained on. Whereas when our current training regimes only require that they have nice distinct representations for a neighborhood around each data point. And so when we think about things like SimClear and these self-supervised things, they also they have the nice property of trying to make sure that every input image has a distinct representation, which is better. They avoid a sort of collapse down to single points, but they still don't guarantee that stuff outside of the training set has distinct representations. And so when you look at these TSNE or UMAP visualizations of what's happened, you see that the training data for the known classes has all been separated out nicely. But for all of the outliers, which were not in the training data, they tend to be more clustered in the middle of the space. But so I think we're really struggling with how to do things in deep learning. When one possibility is to approach anomaly detection as a reconstruction task, right? So if we think about PCA as sort of the simple case, right? If I have a bunch of data that basically lives on a low dimensional multivariate Gaussian, PCA will basically find that and define the axes as the axes of the ellipsoid of that data. And so then if we have outliers that go out in different directions than that ellipse, they will have a big reconstruction error, because they'll be projected down onto the manifold of the training data. And then when we reconstruct, there'll be a big gap between their projected value and their real value. So in fact, this is what Kerry Wagstaff's technique, it relies on the reconstruction error of PCA. But she has a good distance to work with. And so people have obviously tried to use autoencoders for anomaly detection, and using the reconstruction error as a measure of the anomaly signal. But standard autoencoders are really hard to train, and people have struggled a lot to get those to work. Now with VAEs, things work better, but there's still a tendency for autoencoders to learn general image compression algorithms. And so that they can correctly reconstruct images that were very different from the ones they were trained on. So, because what we're looking for is basically a reconstruction task that will fail for novel data.
Yeah.
Rather than succeeding. And
Absolutely.
The trouble is often the deep neural networks are too good, and they learn a general thing that succeeds on new data as well. So,
I see. Yeah.
So we're definitely struggling in this field right now.
Okay, so what you're talking about in terms of the reconstruction error as a way of detecting that something is different here. So this is an anomaly, or in forecasting, in forecast models. So the model makes a prediction about the future, and when the data comes, it measures the distance. Okay, the prediction was bad. So I get that part, but asking about the hyperparameter tuning, even for non-neural nets.
Right.
So one class SVM, for example,
Right.
any other network. Let me just tell you what I think personally. So if we don't have any anomalies in our training set, the only approach that comes to my mind is to come up with a smart way. And again, let's say we're not dealing with good features, like engineer features, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Which is even more difficult. So the feature vectors are not that meaningful. Now, the only approach that comes to my mind is to grab our vector of raw data, for example, the entire training set, and define a measure of distance, I suppose, across each and every one of those. I'm going to say features, but they're not linear features, right? Mm-hmm. Dimensions, exactly. Mm-hmm. So define some sort of a distribution across each one of those dimensions. For example, say a Gaussian distribution across mm-hmm. The values across our training set, and then for each feature, we can sample from the details of the distribution, and then we will generate some, hopefully, I mean, it's a very naive way of doing it, I suppose, but we'll end up with a data set that by some measure of distance is different to our training set across each and every dimension, and then use this as a representative.
I mean, that's essentially the same as saying I want to find a density level set. I want to estimate the probability density of my data, mm-hmm. and then find a level set that is basically the one class boundary that says I want to contain 99% of the probability density inside this level set, and everything outside of it I'll treat as anomalous. So that's
can we use that for? Sorry to interrupt, but in particular, I'm asking about. If we found a way to have a representative, a fair representative of the anomalies during our training,
yes,
how can we do exactly hyperparameter tuning? And what's the general way of doing
it? I think we need some additional source of information. Obviously, without it, we're stuck. So one source is to have some way of generating or simulating anomalies. And so people have looked at training GANs, and then if there are these steerable GANs where we can extrapolate out in lots of directions, we can go beyond our data, perhaps. People have looked at just in the sort of SimClear style. You may have seen this CSI paper from Korea, where they look at some of the kinds of image transformations that we would use if we were doing data set augmentation, and then look at ones that do not preserve the class identity. So rotation, for instance, may destroy class identity, and they use those to generate sort of pseudo anomalies. The other thing I think is if so, that's one line, right? Is can we generate anomalies? And also, I think when we've done some work here at Oregon State with once you deploy a system and you're detecting anomalies, you start to get some labeled anomalies, some like computer fraud or manufacturing errors or something. And so now you can start to tune against that. But another thing is, if you have the other thing we've investigated is, suppose you have a collection of unlabeled data that is contaminated with anomalies. And you're willing to assume that those anomalies are coming from some distribution. This is a big issue here, is if we're in the adversarial setting, we can't assume that the anomalies are going to have a pattern to them. The adversaries will be constantly reacting to whatever we do, like in cybersecurity. But if we're in more the anomalies on Mars or self-driving cars or something, then we might hope that the outliers come from some distribution. We just don't know what it is. So if we can get an unlabeled sample, we can think of that as a mixture distribution over the known classes and the unknowns. And so we had a paper at AAAI 2018, was it ICML 2018, where we showed that you can then unmix that mixture and use that to estimate, say, your missed alarm rate for different settings of a hyperparameter. We were just trying to set the alarm threshold, Because normally, if you only have the inliers, you can control your false alarm rate by setting the anomaly threshold so that you will only, so that among your known objects, you'll only say declare 5% of them to be anomalies. So you can control your false alarm rate, that would be 5%. But you don't know what your missed alarm rate is because you just don't have any training data. But with the mixture thing, you can also estimate your missed alarm rate. And so you can set a parameter for that too. So, but the bottom line is you need some additional source of constraints. So whether it's your domain knowledge that lets you synthesize possible anomalies, or it's maybe an IID assumption and then unlabeled data. Those are the only two ideas that I have right now. I mean, maybe there's some other ideas that might come out of thinking of the time series and forecasting and trends. And you could say, well, you know, we think the distribution is moving in this direction, so we could generate data points from the future by extrapolation.
It seems that this particular field, a subfield of anomaly detection, seems to be seems to be sort of thirsty for an application of human in the loop, like. To get some information. Otherwise, as you said, we can't.
But I think in a lot of applications. So you know, I'm involved with a company, Big ML, and we have a client that is it's a manufacturing application where they're doing some sort of inspection at one point in the assembly line, and they want to detect anomalies right there if there was something that went wrong with that one step. But we eventually get labels. At the end of the assembly line, they have to do a final detailed quality inspection of the thing they're making. And then we find out, yes, there was a problem. And so with some delay, we get labels on the anomalies. And so then the question is, can you feed that back? But the thing is, you don't want to assume that there's just a fixed number of ways of being anomalous. The thing about anomalies is you can be, you know, it's sort of like Tolstoy. The nominal points are all nominal in the same way, but the anomalies can be each uniquely different. So that's why the one class approach is still very important. To say that anything outside this boundary in any direction, we want to declare to be anomalous.
Okay, so the last question, Professor. I'm really excited to know your opinion about this. What is the next big thing in ML? And by big, I mean revolutionary big.
Revolutionary big thing. I don't know. I don't know if I have a revolution to offer. I mean, people are clearly want to explore the combination of symbolic and neural representations. And so neural symbolic systems, I think, you know, I think we don't really have a good theory about why symbols are so useful to us. Right. When we program systems by hand, we do it all with symbols. But from a machine learning point of view, it's been much easier to work with these connectionist distributed representations. So what's going on there from a sort of information theoretic or computational perspective? I would guess that probably we prefer symbols when we communicate, right? So language. You know, we use symbols in language, and we kind of know from Shannon that symbols can be very and digitizing, going to digital representations instead of analog, gives us tremendous error control ability that we lack with analog signals, because we create these big empty places that are illegal representations and separate things out. So maybe that's why we like symbols. Maybe it's an error reduction and compact, efficient communication mechanism. And maybe our brain internally needs to communicate with itself, and so it develops these things. But obviously, we also communicate with other people, and so we need these representations. So maybe that's part of what they do. But I don't feel super educated on this myself. But the notion of internal symbolic representations has been a driving force in artificial intelligence from the late 40s and early 50s of the last century, right? you can sort of see in those days it was a reaction to pure behavioralism, right? Was the idea that we can't just look at observable behavior. We need to think about internal mental representations and what those might be. Now, with connectionism and machine learning, we're mostly working at the, at the behavioral level, just the inputs and the outputs. We have internal state, but it's not interpretable very much. And so I think that now the pendulum is going to swing back the other way, because to engineer these systems and to get explanations out of them, we need to make the jump back into symbols and structured internal representations. Not only for that, I think even to deal with object-centered representations of the world, we need objects and relationships, I think we'll run into the challenges of embedding those. Embedding spaces are very useful for the similarity calculations, but I don't think they support object-centered reasoning.
Professor, that was an absolute pleasure to have this discussion with you. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope that you enjoyed the talk as well.
Oh yeah, it's always fun to talk about these things, and yeah, I just want to emphasize how little we know and how little we understand. And certainly me personally, yeah, I think we're all grasping to try to understand all the exciting research and how to integrate it, but also all these amazing open problems that we need to explore further. So fun to talk with you. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. Likewise. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.